All right. Today is October 18th, 2017, and land use hearing. And I'll start by, please join me in a Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And we don't do roll on this, do we? So we'll go ahead and get started. I now call to order the October 18, 2017 public hearing to consider two separate application requests. Did I jump a page? Okay. Before we begin, oh wait, I already did that. At this hearing, we will consider an application by Pacific Northwest Solar LLC affecting property generally adjacent to Highway 26 Southeast Firwood Road and Southeast Trumbull Road. The application before us consists of two separate requests. One, a reasons exception to statewide planning goal 3 Z0287-17-CP and a conditional use permit for the construction operation of photovoltaic, that's it, isn't it? Photovoltaic solar power generation facility on approximately 70 to 80 acres of land that is zoned exclusive farm use Z0288-17-C. Hearing today proceed as follows. We'll first hear from a staff presentation from Senior Planner Martha Fritzie, planner. I was going to change that senior to something. Expert planner. The applicant will then have 20 minutes to present. Next, I will open a public hearing for public testimony, beginning with public officials who will have 5 minutes each. Shouldn't even have to read all this because there's no public officials here except us. Then I will open, then representatives of recognized community planning organizations and agencies will have 3 minutes each. Finally, other people wishing to testify will have 3 minutes each. The board will then deliberate and either render a decision today or set the time to make the decision at a later date. Assisting us in the hearing today is Clerk Kevin Moss, Senior Planner Martha Fritzie, and Assistant County Counsel Nate Boderman. If you wish to testify, please complete one of the green cards and give it to Kevin. If you have prepared a written statement, please give a copy to Kevin and use your time to summarize what you have written. Everyone who wishes to speak will have an opportunity to do so. We'll now begin the hearing with a legal statement by Nate Boderman, followed by staff report by Martha Fritzie.
Good morning, Commissioners. The hearing this morning is what we traditionally call a quasi-judicial land use hearing, which means two important things for the Commissioners and for people participating in the hearing this morning. First, all the criteria that can be considered in reaching a decision have been identified in the staff report. So testimonies, arguments, and evidence must be directed towards the criteria identified in the staff report or other relevant criteria found in the comprehensive plan or other land use regulations that the county has adopted. Second, failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the decision maker and the parties an opportunity to respond to the issue may preclude further appeal to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals on that particular issue. Failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues relating to proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow the local government or its designee to respond to the issue precludes an action for damages in circuit court. Once final, these decisions may be appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals. And at this time, I'll ask the Board of Commissioners to disclose any ex parte contacts, bias, or conflicts of interest that you might have.
Anybody?
I have none. However, I'm going to take this opportunity to say I'm really wondering if the state planning goals are conflicted, or at least some of our goals are conflicted in that, and I won't belabor this, in that on our last solar hearing, the issue was challenged by LCDC. The land that it was in question was not ideal farmland because of the soil, the wetland aspect, or and so therefore we had passed that, and it was appealed by LCDC. And we'll find out why, but I just thought if the state and our state planning goals and clean energy and all that is very, very important, and our climate is a big issue, that allowing for solar on less than ideal farmland would be valued. In this case, apparently it is not. And so I just think there's I won't say a conflict of interest of any of us, because that was the question, but it seems to be really a conflict that we have no control over. So I think it really puts us in a very odd position when it comes to making these decisions, because we either care about it or not. China is in this, and I'll stop here on the China piece, but China's putting in thousands and thousands of acres of solar panels. And the reason why? Because of the air pollution, because of the air quality. And so that affects us globally, and it just seems odd that our last one would be appealed by the state itself. I just think that they have a conflict of interest.
I'll say a couple things. First, just to wrap up the required disclosures here, if anyone wishes to challenge the impartiality of any commissioner, please indicate your intention to do so in any oral or written testimony that you may provide. And second, just to update on the prior appeal, what was done, LCDC at their last meeting in September voted to proceed with the appeal to LUBA. What we've done is we've agreed with Department of Justice to stay that appeal because, as you indicate, DLCD and LCDC are appealing a number of these on the same basis. And one of those particular appeals affecting Jackson County is pending right now before the Land Use Board of Appeals. And so the intent there is to let that resolve itself and see how that affects any of these subsequent applications. So everything is stayed right now pending the outcome of the Jackson County appeal, which we hope to have a decision on month and a half. So
And
we'll report back.
do we anticipate that this one will be appealed as well?
I'll let Martha speak to that. I believe that LCDs or DLCDs submitted testimony in opposition, which would indicate that they probably intend to do so. But again, Martha would know.
That's a difficult question. They have submitted written testimony. They are not here today, and they did not come to the Planning Commission to submit oral testimony. I've heard rumblings that they are not going to appeal it, but they have the standing and they could. And the issues that we believe they are going to identify in the appeal are similar. Some of them are similar.
Thank you.
All right, so, Martha.
Yep.
Oh, Ken.
What?
Ken, you had something?
What's the objection? A couple of questions. What's LCDC's objection to this particular land use?
I'm not sure what they identified in their intent to appeal, but in the testimony that they've submitted, it's generally around the reasons exception and the arguments that are being used under the first criteria for need, and using statewide planning goal 13 to justify the need. It's kind of.
Can you be a little more general?
Soils,
Bring it down to.
protect farmland. That's what Jim told me. It's to protect farmland.
I mean, is that what it's about? Protecting farmland?
I believe it's about protecting farmland,
Okay.
yes.
Well, I mean,
So it's kind of technical, and it's hard to bring it down any lower than that. It's a lot of theoretical arguments, really.
And I'll add to that. This is going to be probably a crude explanation, but when you're resolving conflicts between the statewide planning goals, there's this reasons process. And one of the reasons is that another seemingly conflicting goal justifies raising the priority of one goal over another. And the economic development goals in this particular instance is one justification that we've been using for an exception to the agricultural goals. I'm sorry, energy, I'm sorry, the energy production. As a reason for elevating the priority of that particular goal over the agricultural use protection goals. And so what DLCD's argument is, probably in its most basic form, is that that's inappropriate to use that particular goal to justify an exception to the agricultural use goal 3.
If I understood the history at all, it's, according to what Martha said, that these soils were evaluated, or the areas were evaluated for soil quality in the 80s. There's an overlay that suggests what these soils are. And we're looking at a very specific 70 to 80 acres. Did they drill down that much, or was this a highly generalized evaluation of farmland?
By they, do you mean when the soil survey was done?
Yeah. Because, I mean, I could imagine you could have 100 acres over here that's absolutely great soil, and right next to it, you could have some soil that is pretty poor. Do they drill down that much, or or was it just a big overlay that this general area is farmland?
So I believe it was a pretty detailed survey because our maps are very detailed. There are very small areas that differ from the surrounding area, and so I don't know specifically how it was done, but I do know that it was an on-the-ground survey of the soil types. It wasn't just a broad
Okay. So,
30,000-foot look.
so in terms of us having to make this decision, we can reasonably assume that what's being alleged by the applicant, that 70 acres, 80 acres of land is, while it may be in an EFU zone, is very poorly arable.
Yes, and we can get
that
to
it?
that in the presentation.
Okay.
But I guess when we get to the staff's recommendation, obviously, you know, we're recommending approval, so I guess the answer is yes. I mean, we can reasonably assume that. But it's ultimately up to you, and I can sort of get through the specifics.
Yeah, we want the battle of conflicting good things, right? We want to protect farmland, good farmland that's being farmed, and yet we also want to have alternatives to coal and gas-fired power, which this actually provides. So I just want to be sure that as we make these exceptions, that that we don't make the mistake of taking perfectly good arable land and turning that into solar panels. That land does need to be protected, and that's my concern in trying to figure out how we go forward with this. In general, I want to do, like anybody in politics, I want to do both. Okay, I want to protect the farmland, but I also want to make sure that we can produce electricity in a way that is environmentally appropriate. So that's sort of what I'm looking for.
So I want to just address that a little bit because I kind of checked. So if I have a piece of land that is a high-value farmland, and I don't agree with it, I can hire a soil scientist to do tests and dispute the quality of the soil. That's how, if it's mapped that way and you want to change it, that's how you do it. Now, my understanding, I know we're going to get into this, and I'm sure, that there are maps and they have done testing, and from what I read, this soil is not high-value farmland. So it's, and I think it's different from the other one, in that while it was wetlands, it still had a classification of high-value farmland.
That's true.
So that's the difference here. So let's get on with the presentation.
Okay.
And then one question I'll have as you go through the presentation, if you could address it, is how did they determine that this land, did they go through a scientific analysis?
Well,
That'll be my question, or was it?
Yeah.
I think Ken kind of asked the
That's
question.
essentially it.
There was a map, they analyzed the soil, and you were classified either this or that or that. This one was classified, not high-value farmland. If you were classified high-value farmland and you disagreed with it, you would have a soil scientist test it and prove that it isn't. And that's how you would change the map, basically. That's my understanding.
Yeah, I guess my concern was simply that it's being alleged in the document that that is not considered high-value farmland, but rather low-value farmland soils. And I just want to know that that is done not on the basis of somebody just saying it,
Yeah.
but that testing was done that assures us that that is the case, because that's definitive as far as I'm concerned.
Makes a difference. Paul?
Just want to say for anyone watching this, and wondering what we're talking about, Oregon, the state of Oregon has 19 state planning goals. Agriculture is goal 3, but goal 6 is air, land, and water, or air, water, and land. And actually, goal 6 is really conflicted in this case within itself, and this also affects goal 9 to a lesser degree and goal 13, which is, so when you tie all that together, to have the state contest this is the unusual aspect of what we're doing here today.
Do you have that tattooed on your arm, those goals?
Well, they're right here on my iPhone now. The only one that's tattooed is goal 1,
Okay. All right, so transportation, huh?
public involvement.
Public involvement, all right. All right, let's go ahead and start the presentation.
Okay, great. So I'm Martha Fritzy, Senior Planner with the county's Planning and Zoning Division. We are here today to talk about the goal exception and conditional use permit proposed for a 70 to 80 acre photovoltaic solar power generation facility. This requires a reasons exception to statewide planning goal agriculture because the administrative rules specifically state if this type of a facility is going to occupy more than 20 acres of arable farmland, which we'll talk about in a minute, it requires a goal exception. The proposal is for, as I mentioned, 70 to 80 acres, single axis tracking photovoltaic modules. According to the site plan and the applicant's materials, approximately 37,000 of these photovoltaic modules. It is largely an unmanned facility, except there are occasional maintenance and inspection visits. The site's located adjacent to the southeastern boundary of Sandy's urban growth boundary and their urban reserve. It is outside of their urban reserve. The site borders Highway 26, Furwood, and Trouble roads. And the legal lot of record that this is on is comprised of 3 tax lots that total 122.2 acres. The owner of this property does own some adjacent farmland as well, and he spoke at length about that farmland at the Planning Commission hearing. I was hoping he'd be here today. He may still show up. All of this land is zoned exclusive farm use. As you can see in this aerial photo, it is partially cultivated with Christmas trees currently. There's also a house on the property up in the northeast area, sort of right where the Southeast Canyon Valley Road, where that word starts. That house will remain there. It won't be impacted by the proposed development. The facility will retain the existing access off of Highway 26. Unless ODOT, who we haven't heard from, has an issue with that, they've proposed an alternative access off of Southeast Trouble Road if they can't use the access off of Highway 26. So as we were discussing, the site is comprised predominantly of low-value farmland soils. Those are based on maps from a soil survey that was completed in the early to mid-1980s. It identified the soils. It's not done on a lot-by-lot basis. There's a layer that identifies the various soil types, and they're classified class 1 through 8, and then identified as either high-value or low-value farmland soils. The Oregon Revised Statutes identify this soil survey as the basis to make this determination, and also identify which particular types of soils are considered high value and low value. And so that's what we base our determination on. The site is relatively flat, and it has no known natural resources or hazard areas. And when I say that, I'm specifically referring to ones that we would regulate in our zoning and development ordinance. And we can talk a little bit more about the existing development and agriculture on the site as we work through the goal exception criteria. The proposed site plan is identified up here in this slide. You'll notice a big swath across the middle. It's a 500-foot easement for Bonneville Power Administration. That's a power line easement. That easement's actually regulated through them, not through the county. My understanding is you're not allowed to have any structures within that easement. The farming can continue in that easement, and it's the intent, it's our understanding that the farmer or the owner of the property intends to keep farming on that area of the property to the extent possible. The proposed facility would be sort of in these two sections, and it would be completely fenced. There would be some internal access roads going through the easement area, though. There are a whole slew of relevant policies and criteria. They are all listed up here, from the statewide planning goals, the Oregon revised statutes, administrative rules, comprehensive plan policies, and finally our zoning and development ordinance. I am not going to spend a lot of time going through each of these. They're outlined in sufficient detail, I think, in the Planning Commission staff report. I am going to keep it pretty high level and hopefully brief, because if you recall, a couple of months ago, we did have another proposal in front of you for goal exception for a photovoltaic solar power generation facility. And so I'm going to skip a lot of the background and just sort of jump right into the specifics of this for this project. I'm happy to answer questions, though, if I skip something over that you have a question about. So first and foremost, why is a goal exception needed? Well, this property is designated as natural resource land, agriculture, and it's zoned exclusive farm use. Section 401 of the county zoning and development ordinance allows these types of facilities as a conditional use, subject to the administrative rule that's listed up there. That administrative rule has definitions of high-value farmland, arable land, and non-arable lands. Depending on what type of farmland you have, it determines what the trigger is for requiring a goal exception. And so arable land is defined in the administrative rule as land that doesn't contain high-value farmland soils, which this property does not, but has a history of cultivation, which this property does. And so this property is considered arable farmland. According to the administrative rule, if you are citing a facility larger than 20 acres on the arable farmland, it must obtain the goal exception. So therefore, we are here talking about a goal exception to statewide planning goal 3, which is agriculture. You recall there's 3 types of goal exceptions: physically developed, irrevocably committed, and the reasons exception. This proposal is for a reasons exception, and there are 4 criteria that need to be met under the reasons exception: need, alternatives analysis, the consequences, and the compatibility criteria. So the first one is need, and we were discussing this a little bit earlier. This gets to you need to justify that there is a need. You need to justify the reason you are proposing the exception to the statewide planning goal. And in this case, the applicant's relying on goal 13, which requires projects to utilize renewable resources, including solar, whenever possible. And if you recall, we had some conversation about this at the last hearing. There have been some changes in state law that are now requiring a conversion to renewable energy sources rather than coal-fueled energy generation for our large power companies in the state. And this property is designed to help Portland General Electric, which will be buying the power from this property. It's designed to help PGE meet that goal. The alternatives analysis in this case was a pretty easy analysis. The administrative rule requires that you look at 3 different areas inside a UGB. You have to justify why the particular proposal couldn't reasonably be accommodated in any alternative areas, including inside a UGB. This is adjacent to the City of Sandy's UGB. There's a number of reasons why it couldn't locate inside the UGB. For one, there were no parcels identified that were large enough, but also, if you recall, not too long ago, maybe earlier this summer or last spring, Sandy came in here with a proposal to expand their urban growth boundary. They did the analysis. All of the land inside their urban growth boundary has been identified as needed for future urban development, not a facility like this. This is not considered urban development. And so it's not a reasonable alternative. And then outside the UGB, you need to look at land that would not require a goal exception. And there are no other sites in the study area that was identified that would require that would not require a similar goal exception to what's being proposed here. And to identify the study area, the applicant looked at a 2-mile radius around the Sandy substation, and there's a maximum distance for financial feasibility for these types of, did I say 2 miles?
I think it's 2 miles.
Okay, I thought I said 2 miles. There's a maximum distance to retain financial feasibility for a facility like this because the facility is required to pay all of the connection costs. And so that area was identified by the applicants as 2 miles. And so they looked within the 2 miles to see if there were any alternative sites that could fit into any of these categories. DLCD did identify an alternative site in the testimony that they provided that they asked the applicant to consider further. That site, the applicant has determined is not a reasonable alternative for a number of reasons. One is it's farther than the 2 miles. It is also actively being farmed. It contains better soils than this property, and the property owner has expressed no interest in having their property developed with this type of a facility. And so that is not, it's been determined that that would not be a reasonable alternative site for this particular property. You look confused.
So why did they suggest that property then?
I don't know, except that the way the rule is written is that you can generally look at areas, but if somebody identifies a site that they think might be potentially a good alternative, then you're required to look at it further. And so they identified this site which required the applicant to look at it further. In the further look, they determined that it really wasn't going to be an appropriate site. I don't know why DLCD identified a site that was outside of the 2-mile study area.
Well, especially citing, as you mentioned, the alternate site had better soil. So it seems to be almost in conflict with what the purpose of Goal 3 is. So, and if I'm hearing collectively, what you've said in the last few minutes here is that because of the acreage, or clarify please, that it couldn't be done in the urban growth boundary, that's not an alternative. Looking within the UGB of Sandy, it's got to be done outside. Is that because of the size of the acreage itself requirement?
Yeah, there were no sites identified inside the urban growth boundary that were big enough.
Okay.
And so just to be clear, the site that DLCD identified was not zoned EFU, and so it wouldn't require a goal exception, which is one of the reasons they identified it. But simply not requiring the goal exception doesn't necessarily mean it's a reasonable alternative. And then so finally, under number 3, under the alternatives, you need to look at committed natural resource areas and areas in or near unincorporated communities. This site is more than 6 miles away from the nearest unincorporated community, so clearly that wouldn't be a reasonable alternative. And for this particular type of a goal exception, an area that's already committed isn't particularly relevant because the administrative rule specifies the need for the goal exception simply based on the type of farmland that is there and the size of the facility. There were no committed parcels identified anyway but it's a little irrelevant in this case. And so no reasonable alternatives were identified in this process. The third criteria is consequences, and you have to determine whether the adverse environmental, economic, social, and energy impacts of the proposed use would be, the finding is that those impacts are no greater than if the use were to locate on another site that would require a goal exception. In other words, if there's another large piece of farmland, you need to be able to find that the impacts are not any greater by locating on the site that you're proposing versus one of these other sites. And so, I guess first and foremost, again, this is low-value farmland. It contains low-value farmland soils. There are some other agricultural properties in the area that would potentially be large enough to site this facility. They all would require the goal exception. A lot of them contain high-value farmland. A lot of them are also in production. And this particular site, based on the owner's testimony at the Planning Commission hearing, is located on his, I believe he controls over 200 acres in this area. It is located on a portion of the property that he has historically had the most trouble actually farming. And so to locate this sort of site elsewhere on his particular properties or on other agricultural properties would likely cause greater impacts. And furthermore, the size and orientation and topography of the subject property has enabled the applicants to design it to most efficiently use the land that they need to use for the facility and not have to impact a larger amount of land than would be necessary. And then so finally, the compatibility criteria. You need to find that the proposed use is compatible with other adjacent uses or can be made so through mitigation measures. And this one's pretty simple. This is a passive use. It doesn't emit any smells, sounds, very little traffic. The applicants are proposing to retain a visual buffer along both of the roads, along Trouble Road and Furwood. And there's just generally no evidence to suggest that a facility like this substantially limits or impairs surrounding farm or forest operations or nearby residences. And in fact, the owner of the property has every intention of continuing to farm the rest of his properties that would be adjacent to this. So clearly there's no thought that there's going to be any impact, any negative impact on the continuation of farming of those properties. So other relevant criteria, statewide planning goals, Oregon administrative rules, comprehensive plans and goals, and the zoning and development ordinance criteria are listed up here. Again, I'm not going to beat them to death. The most relevant in this case would be the Oregon administrative rule listed up here, which in addition to requiring the goal exception has a number of required criteria that a proposed photovoltaic solar power generation facility needs to meet, including no unnecessary impacts to agricultural operations on the property. The soil erosion and compaction and weed control are criteria that can largely be taken care of through the conditions of approval. And there are criteria that require you look at a 1 mile study area and identify how many other similar facilities are within the area, which there were none. And then there's criteria that talk about justifications for allowing the siting of a facility on arable land versus high value versus low value. And the applicant has addressed all of those to our satisfaction. We feel that it's met all of those criteria. And moving on to the conditional use permit, that is largely regulated through the county zoning and development ordinance, section 1203. And the criteria that a conditional use permit needs to meet, again, talks about things like the site's suitable for the proposed use. It won't alter the character of the surrounding area in a manner that would substantially limit, impair, or preclude the use of adjacent properties. It does need to comply with any applicable other requirements, design standards primarily that are found in the zoning and development ordinance. And it needs to be consistent with section 1007.09, and the safety of the transportation system must be adequate to serve the proposed development. Again, this is a largely unmanned facility. Our zoning development specifically exempts unmanned facilities. It says like cell towers, and we're looking at this as a similar facility. Specifically exempts them from a concurrency requirement for traffic. The engineering division has looked at their site plan and determined that the transportation system could adequately serve this property. And then finally, in section 401, the exclusive farm use, there are development standards, including setbacks, which this project will be required to meet. And again, there needs to be a finding that it won't force significant changes or impact the ability of surrounding properties to continue to do their farm and forest operations. And we have already determined that it would not force those changes. And so staff finds that this proposal meets all the applicable state, regional, and county criteria for both the reasons exception and for the conditional use permit, and recommends approval subject to the recommended conditions of approval that are found in the Planning Commission staff report. The Planning Commission held a public hearing on September 11th. There was only one party that testified from the public and was supportive of the project. The issues that were discussed generally related to the current usage of the property, the soils, the farming, the history of the farming on the property, and other surrounding properties that were under the same ownership that are currently being farmed by the owner. The Planning Commission recommended approval with a unanimous vote, again, subject to the recommended conditions of approval. And that is it for my presentation today.
Great, any questions, clarifying questions?
So I just wanted to clarify that this particular piece of property is not in rural reserve.
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's not in what?
It's not rural reserve.
No.
So it's one of those undesignated areas. It's in kind of no man's land. Pardon me, well, Sandy has a portion in Metro, don't they? Or maybe I'm wrong.
I don't think so. Do they?
Oh, okay, well.
No, but, so it's not
But
urban
we-
reserve, it's
it's not-
undesignated?
It's undesignated.
But we have auspice over rural reserve, so I just wanted to make sure that it was undesignated. Okay, great.
Okay, I'm trying to find where the applicant gets to talk. I guess I just talk about public testimony next, right? Yep. And that's part of the applicant.
Page 3 there for you.
Okay. We'll now open the public comment portion of the hearing. We'll first hear from the applicant. We'll have up to 20 minutes. Are there any public officials in the audience wishing to testify? I don't see any, so you're not going to give any time. Are there any representative CPOs? We will now hear testimony from the applicant.
And Chair, I'll be stepping out here in a couple minutes.
Okay. All right.
Hello, my name is Steve Schmidt. I'm here representing Pacific Northwest Solar on the CUP application for the Furwood Solar Project. And just some quick background information on Pacific Northwest Solar. We're a solar developer that started here in the Pacific Northwest. We have since expanded operations to most of the continental U.S. With currently over 200 megawatts of development and pipeline in various locations across the U.S. We've developed a reputation for a solutions-based process. In this, we recognize that every local area has specific elements, and projects need to be manipulated such that they fit into specific local regulations and local specific solutions. And that's certainly what we try to do in every area, as we have on this project. And our management team has a pretty diverse base of their technical experience. In addition, obviously, to solar, we also have civil engineering, environmental engineering, legal, and real estate experience interior to our firm. So the Furwood project, so this is just an outline similar to the pictures that were in staff's report. The project will be a 10 megawatt AC photovoltaic solar facility. It's located right there at the intersection of Furwood and Trouble. The power contract for this is a wholesale contract to PGE. It's what's considered an avoided cost contract, which means that the PGE developed rates that were approved by the PUC for the cost of power, traditional power that they would have to pay anyway. This project is able to provide power at those same rates, and so PGE is then would purchase the power from this project, offsetting traditional power that they would purchase anyway at the same rates. So it really is basically a net. It's not an increased cost of power over traditional sources. It's the same source for renewable power instead of traditional. And we would expect construction to begin in late spring of 2018. So this is the same slide from staff's report. It obviously shows the project being bisected by the BPA lines that run through the middle of the site. There is an existing road that goes through that area that would be maintained and utilized to access both sides of the facility. And access to the facility, like was mentioned, would be off of Highway 26 or Southeast Trouble. So these are some pictures of the landscaping that was mentioned to provide the visual mitigation. The one picture is looking west along Southeast Trouble Road. This is from the corner intersection of Trouble and Furwood. And with the panels being approximately 6 feet in height off the ground, you can see that there's pretty adequate visual screening into the project site itself that's existing currently. And that vegetation would be maintained to keep that visual screen intact. So some benefits to the local community. Obviously, there's some significant economic impacts. During construction, we'd anticipate that the number of on-site jobs would peak between 100 and 200. In addition to the on-site construction jobs, there'll be many additional engineering, surveying, environmental, legal office jobs that will be required to support the design and construction of the project. Additionally, obviously, equipment suppliers, material suppliers, and the service industry would receive a big boon as well. It's estimated by the National Renewable Energy Laboratories studies that this project would provide approximately $6.8 million in local spending simply during construction. During operations, it's anticipated there'd be about 1 to 2 full-time equivalent positions required for the maintenance of the facility, and that local spending during the operations would be approximately $80,000 a year. Additionally, we expect that the project, well, we've done some things so the project will benefit local agriculture. The project is proposing to seed the site with pollinating plants and pollinator habitat plants. It's just general knowledge that habitat loss is a major reason for the decline in pollinator populations. And per the Oregon Department of Agriculture, approximately 2/3 of the world's food and fiber crops rely on pollination for reproduction. So what this project is proposing to do is essentially to become more or less a pollinator preserve and be an area where local pollinators will be able to grow and thrive and thus benefit other local agriculture in the area. And that's an effort by us to recognize that we're trying to not just be a net neutral for local agriculture, but try to be a benefit as well. Historical use of the site, the project is not viable farm ground. As was stated earlier, the owner testified at the Planning Commission, and he was supposed to be here today. I hope he didn't have trouble getting here for some reason. He had confirmed that he would be here. But he did testify at Planning Commission that he's tried multiple things on the property, in this particular portion of the property, without success. He purchased the property in the early 90s from the prior owner who was in default. At that time, that owner was growing, I believe it was strawberries on the facility. The current owner attempted to continue growing strawberries. That did not prove financially viable. He has since switched to Christmas trees, and also they're simply not growing well. He believes the problem, I believe he stated, was some form of root rot that's essentially causing the trees to not grow well and to die. And if you go out there, you can see that that area is very sparsely populated. As was mentioned, he does have over 200 acres contiguous with this facility, and he also has at least another 100 acres that's not contiguous, but it's nearby. We spoke to him about all of his property and where would be the best place for the facility, and he directed us to this location because it simply is not proving to be financially viable for farming. Additionally, he has also said that this facility and the stable income that would come to him from the lease will benefit his operations on the remainder of his property. And that's because obviously farming has a strong boom and bust cycle and a relatively stable base coming in. He believes would be a big benefit to his ability to continue farming elsewhere. Also, there's no irrigation currently to this project, and there's no new wells that will be allowed. And also, we've become aware of a recent regulation that's called the Application Exclusion Zone, which will not allow the owner to apply certain pesticides and other things to portions of the property that are within a distance from local public areas, which is there's a school within to the south of the project site and some of the roadways. So he's actually will be further impacted with what he can do agriculturally with the site than he even is currently. Some of the environmental benefits, the project will produce up to 10 megawatts of AC of electricity that will be used primarily in Clackamas County. And that is important in that this project will not only produce energy, it will save energy because this energy is interjected into the grid at the distribution level and then is immediately used in the surrounding vicinity of the project and in the town of Sandy after going through the substation. Energy is used at the closest point from where it's interjected into the grid. Currently, Sandy would be served basically by high transmission lines that are bringing power from long distances away, potentially from coal-fired plants in Montana or elsewhere. It's difficult to say. But it's not difficult to say that once this project is in, the power that the project is producing would serve the Sandy area and would preclude that energy that needs to be transferred long distances. And there is a lot of energy that is lost when energy is transferred long distances over transmission lines. Approximately 6,000 tons of CO2 a year would be offset by the energy that's simply generated by the project. It's not even estimating the additional energy that would be conserved. And that's approximately enough power for 1,500 homes. Additionally, the property taxes that will come from this would be equivalent to $60,000 or $70,000 a year, and that's compared to approximately $1,000 a year currently. In addition to the additional revenue that comes in, solar projects require very little public services. They don't require water or sewer. They'll require very little benefit from emergency services and so on. So that $70,000 is nearly completely net additive to the budget. And then this is the avoided cost. We had talked about that earlier in the presentation. So at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions or comments. Or actually, sorry, no, I'm not. I didn't think we were quite done yet. We're going to go through some of DLCD's comments. So there's the visibility of the project that we discussed already is mitigated by the vegetation that's in place. As discussed earlier, there's very little noise that's generated by these projects. At the perimeter of the fence, the noise level is effectively equivalent to the background noise in the area. And at 50 feet from the perimeter fence, it's fully inaudible. So DLCD did submit comments on this project, and As was asked earlier about their odds of appealing this one, although they did submit comments, we did reach out and discuss with them. They admitted to us over the phone that they believe this project is well sited and is on essentially the best site it could be in the area. They recognize that the ground is not high value and it's not a good agricultural area. Well, obviously they will have the right, but I think there's a less chance of them appealing the project than some of the other projects that were on high value, fully agriculturally utilized facilities. So just to speak to the farmland classification, it's not high value as is shown in the NCRS soil maps. Additionally, land can be considered high value if it's planted in grapes and above 1,000 feet of elevation or part of a water district. This project is none of those. So this project is definitively not high value land. And it is considered arable due to the attempts at agriculture, but it is not high value. There are no impacts, as was discussed earlier, to adjacent ag uses. The project is a passive facility. The question of Goal 13 and the conflicts with Goal 3 is an interesting one, although we do not believe that there actually is a conflict in this case, because Goal 3 protects from permanent conversion from ag land to non-ag uses. This is not a permanent conversion. This project is a temporary use of the facility that will not damage the land for future agricultural use. And in fact, the pollinating plants that will go into the project will benefit the soil by adding nitrogen and potentially creating a more viable agricultural area after the project is removed at the end of life of the facility. So we disagree in general that there is a conflict here. I think the goals actually work quite well together due to this specific site. There are other situations where a site is fully utilized for agriculture on high value land, and that is a different discussion. The question of the need for the project, indicates that energy service and Clackamas should be substandard before new energy should be provided. This is not only not practical, it's in fact dangerous. You don't wait until until the grid is not functioning to make sure it's still functioning. Everybody wants their power to be on, and we don't want hospitals going down. So PGE has to plan far and ahead to provide energy to a given area, and this is a part of their plan. Proximity to the substation, this was discussed as needing to be the 2-mile distance for financial viability, and that's because we have to pay for any and all upgrades to the system that we cause, including running a dedicated fiber line from the substation all the way to the project site. So every foot that we get further away, the project gets more expensive. And that 2-mile distance is really the limit of financial viability. The alternatives analysis was the site that was discussed is obviously it's over the 2-mile distance, which is one problem, and that landowner is simply not interested in doing a project. So we do not believe that that alternative site that DOCD specifically noted is a viable site financially or practically. ODE also submitted comments, although they did note that while they submitted comments, they do not comment on projects of this size, which was interesting in itself. Additionally, in 2009, ODE supported the Energy Facility Sightings Council of a reasons-based exception based on Goal 13 over Goal 3 for a wind project. That was a project at a size that they typically comment at. So there is precedence in the state of Oregon for this type of reasons exception. And as was discussed previously, or when we were here last, about the total number of projects that could be possible in Clackamas County. So we did an analysis to review that. There are only 5 additional substations that are capable of supporting a project in Clackamas County. We estimate that those might have a total capacity of 42 megawatts AC for supporting projects, so approximately 4 more of these projects that are currently here. Even if those total of 42 were built out, which would certainly be unlikely. Obviously, in each one of those cases, you would have to find a project site that's functionally compatible, that meets all the land use requirements and so on. It's much more likely that that 42 would be reduced significantly. But even if it were the total 42, that would be approximately 336 acres of land, which represents only 0.2% of farmland currently in production in Clackamas County per the Census of Agriculture. So the reason for going through that is to essentially discuss really what the limits are here, and that we're not talking about blanketing Clackamas County in solar panels, that there really is a very limited capacity and limited locations where these projects are possible, and this project is one of those. Additionally, we wanted to add some information about the decommissioning process. The project at the end of life would be removed per our lease with the landowner within 6 months of the end of life of the facility. The removal for the project is quite simple, actually. It's primarily completed with hand tools to remove the panels and the equipment that sits on top of the vibratory-driven steel foundations. The foundations themselves are simply vertical steel piles that are driven into the ground. At removal, the same piece of equipment that put them in will pull them back out, and the facility would be returned essentially to the pre-project condition. And that is the end of our presentation. So I'd look forward to any questions and comments that you have.
Any questions of the applicant?
Just one, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
I'd like a copy of that, I think it's that last page, questions and mitigations, where you had the less than 2 1,000ths of the farmland.
Sure.
I'd like a copy of that page if I could have it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'd like to get a copy too, please. That's a good idea.
Can I jump in? So we do have this presentation electronically. We can get it to you, but also in Exhibit 7 in your packet, there's page 3 is a little more detailed discussion of his analysis that he was summarizing in that slide.
Commissioner Fisher.
Yeah, I really appreciate you going through the DCLD comments and talking about those. Thousand Friends also submitted a letter that I would just like to get your response on. I don't know, do you by chance have the packet with
I
you?
don't have the packet. But I am familiar with their letter.
Step to the restroom.
And I think the big picture of the, Commissioner Schrader, and have you read are you both familiar with this letter? This
I'm trying to-
Exhibit 11?
I'm trying to find it right now.
Okay.
I haven't seen it. So if I can get a copy of it, that'd be marvelous.
It's Exhibit 11 in.
I'm trying to find it electronically right now.
Pretty far down the packet.
It's really hard to,
I know, this is.
this is hard.
So I have a question, Nate, and I don't know that you can answer this.
I want it printed.
This is farmland. That means for a number of years, it's had a farm deferment.
I don't have a printed
Tax.
packet. I prefer to have it
So I
printed.
assume that this isn't solar farming, so you wouldn't continue with the farm deferment.
I believe that's correct, yeah. We could look into that, but yes, I mean, traditionally, when land is taken out of production, it reverts back. There sometimes is some recapture of the deferred payments. I don't know if you can speak to that more, you probably have the economics more dialed in than we do.
Yes, yeah, I can, yeah. So there will be, we will have to go back 5 years and pay the
taxes
taxes
that were
that they
deferred.
would have paid had it not been in farm deferment.
So is that the rule, 5 years? Is all you have to go back?
I believe it's 5.
Oh, okay.
That sounds right, yeah.
I didn't know
I know
that.
there's some recapture, but.
This is all I have to
Yeah.
work from.
It drives me crazy. Anyway, I just.
All right, took the letter.
Commissioner Schrader with iBooks.
And I looked at it.
So I guess my overall questions, because I'm always looking big picture policy and where we're going and how we need to preserve land and deal with competing uses, and I am all for renewable energy sources and using the sun for energy, but the statements in this letter from Thousand Friends are pretty persuasive. And I think what is in my mind that I just can't shake is I was out in the Furwood, I went on a tour of the Furwood area, met with residents of the area, talked about all of the issues, and that area is so heavily timber. It is a lot of timber production and big uses there. And for this land, with these soils, it seems to me that timber is, right now there's Christmas trees on the land, and timber is a very important use for the agricultural land there. So I'm just interested in you commenting on that as, because that's stated in this Thousand Friends letter as well. And I am not a scientist. I do not, I mean, the whole idea of this soil category for this, and is it high value or low value, or, I mean, sort of my view is this is the land, is it being used for a use that it needs to be used for in accordance with our public policy goals? And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Sure, and I can appreciate that. I guess just so the technical side of it is NRCS, surveyed not just all of Clackamas County, but all of Oregon, and I believe almost all of the U.S., certainly not some parts, but every area that is agriculturally intensive. And they identified what the soil types were and the quality of those soils and so on. So that's where the soil type from a technical perspective comes from and defined specifically as not high value. I think more importantly than that technical look at the soil is the history of use shows that it's simply not very good for growing things on it. The owner, like we said, has tried more than one crop type, basically without success. I don't know if just specific timber has been tried or not in the past, but I know that berries and Christmas trees have proven not financially viable.
And how is, and I don't know if, I don't really have a way to evaluate if whoever is telling us things are true or not true, or what is the level of the truth, but Thousand Friends says that the land, according to those soils, is good for timber. And how is it, and maybe this is a question for our staff, but how is it that timber production isn't high value? It seems like that would be valuable. Like there would be a market for that. And I just speak from the perspective of when I would divorce people and they would have land and they would harvest the trees. They would be worth a lot of money. It was a real value to have trees that would be harvested that would be used.
When we talk about high value, we're specifically talking about agricultural land. There is also, in our natural resource zones, a timber zoning district. And based on the same soil classifications, land is classified by potential productivity for timber as well. And so just because we're not calling it high value versus low value timber land, I mean, there's certainly a value there. There are some areas that are identified as potentially more and less productive. I don't know what the rating for these particular soils on this property is as they relate to timber production. I don't have that little cheat sheet with me. But there's certainly value in timber production. It's just, it's not considered a farm use because it's not something you cultivate and harvest year after year. It's something you plant and wait and then do like a one-time harvest and then replant. And so it is considered a different use. I don't know quite honestly a whole lot about it. I'm not a farmer either. But this was identified and zoned as agricultural land. You could certainly grow timber on it. It's allowed. But I wouldn't be able to speak to how productive that would be without, at a minimum, looking at the chart that we have that identifies it by soil types.
how is it that land is zoned exclusive farm use land, and yet we're hearing that it isn't suitable for farming? I mean, how does that even happen? Why are we here, I guess, if it's land that can't be,
Because it's based on a soil hierarchy.
what, one
It
at a
can
time?
be farmed, but it's also based on a soil. In my opinion, it's based on a soil hierarchy, and this soil is not high-value soil. Now, the land surrounding where our farm is probably the most high-value farmland soil in the region. This is not. And when you talk about the economy of timber production, are you talking about small woodlot owners? Are you talking about the larger companies
there's
that do
larger
it?
companies in
Larger
that area,
companies?
yeah.
Well, this isn't a large, I don't think this is a large company ownership. This would be a small woodlot ownership. And so the economy of that and the scale of the economy, that's quite different than what you would perceive to be as a larger acreage.
I still don't understand how is it that exclusive farmland is categorized that way and has low soil, low value, low grade soil.
Actually, a lot of Oregon, exclusive farm use is one of the defaults effectively. There's a lot less, in this area of Oregon, there's a lot of good soil. In eastern Oregon, the vast majority of it is actually class 7 soil, which is considered not possible to do anything with, and it's all zoned EFU. So that's kind of, I believe, what the default was when it wasn't something else.
Yeah, it's just generally classified farmland. It's just, the soil is not high values farmland soil. In eastern Oregon's could be farmland too. With adequate water and fertilization, you can grow stuff, but that's the difference between this one and the last one. But I'm also concerned that just because in the past it hadn't been farmed in 20 years, just because you can't grow strawberries, it's still farmland.
So, other question, can I just keep asking my questions? Because, thank you, I really appreciate it. So the other thing that really kind of sticks in my mind that is concerning, and mostly from driving through the area and really seeing how beautiful it is incredibly picturesque. And I understand that you're looking at putting barriers so that you can't see the solar panels. But I am very persuaded that we absolutely need solar, but I'm looking at there are other areas, brownfields, industrial areas, parking lots, rooftops. I am concerned about setting a bigger picture policy of solar panels on our farmland. And so I'm just wanting your comment that I know you have a .002 available. I've listened really well to that. I don't understand the idea of there's a substation and you have to be within 2 miles. I mean, maybe I just need a little bit more explanation about the importance of it being sited within certain areas. But in my mind, we need solar, but I'm really wanting you to respond to the perspective that it needs to be placed in these areas that are not on farmland.
Sure. So I guess just for the distance and where it needs to be placed, basically these projects are cited really starting with capacity at a substation. And that's what really identifies where a potential project could go, or at least identifies an area where a project could be in. The Sandy substation is one of those few in Clackamas County that has capacity that is possible. Many of the substations are simply in like the Portland area, in an urban area where there is no possibility of development for a solar project. So this one is there, it has capacity, and there's possibility to do it. Then to get the distance away from that substation that it might be possible, we have to look at the upgrades that we're required to make to the grid. So when we connect a project to the grid, per the contract and per the way the rules work in Oregon, we have to pay for any and all upgrades to the existing grid that the project will cause. And that includes reconductoring lines, it includes things at the substation, it includes protection along the way, along the line, and things like that. Additionally, it includes installing a dedicated fiber line from the substation all the way to the project site. And with all those things, the further we get from a substation, the more expensive all of that becomes. The more protections have to be in place, the more line reconducting there is, the longer the fiber line is. So it gets to a certain point where it's just not going to be financially viable anymore for a project to be further than that distance away.
And what is your point of being away from a substation for it to continue to be financially viable? How far?
2 miles is what we've identified. Most people would say 1, honestly, but we believe 2 miles in this particular case is viable. And that's why we looked at the 2-mile radius around the Sandy substation at where projects could potentially go. And not only was this site not only is this one basically viable from this perspective, but we also believe it is the best location. Any other site in that 2-mile radius had better agricultural production, had better soils, and DLCD admitted that to us over the phone. They think this is the best site for this project. They said, yeah, we're going to submit comments, but we think you guys cited this one well.
Commissioner Schrader.
So, as I look at this letter, they're talking about, other spaces, brownfields on top of roofs. Is that a fragmented way of doing it, and does it actually work to generate the same amount of capacity? That would be my concern, because these seem like smaller spaces that, you could do it locally in a brownfield.
Yeah.
But generally, the size, the scope, the actual generation and the capacity is what I'm kind of wondering about.
You're exactly correct. If there was a large brownfield site within that 2 miles from the Sandy substation, then of course that would absolutely be the answer. Unfortunately, there isn't. I mean, there are. Yeah.
Fortunately.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is the size, because what I'm hearing here is these kind of smaller mom and pop kinds of ways of doing it, and
those.
if we're looking at large scale energy generation.
Correct.
Yeah.
You're right on. Is that the smaller projects like that, like rooftops, even commercial buildings and things, are installed at a much higher cost than large-scale ground-mounted facilities. There is no rooftop or commercial project that could meet the financial requirements that we have for these projects. Those projects all go in. It's actually a totally different style. Those are based on net metering, and they're basically reversing retail power rates. This is a wholesale power rate. This is generated at the cost of traditional energy. It would take many, many, many rooftops and small sites to equal what this project is, and the cost of that power would probably be 2 to 3 times as expensive effectively to make those things pencil financially. It's just not a real viable alternative to this style. Now, the net metering systems and the local systems and so on, there is a place for those in the market, and those sufficiently fill those. But large-scale wholesale power generation is not a place for that type of system.
So it's kind of an adjunct to it, but it really wouldn't, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that the size and the scope and the amount of energy generation, and I don't think anyone, I mean, obviously I wouldn't mind someplace being put on a landfill, mining sites, whatever, abandoned parcels, but that whole notion of a parcel compared to an area that's going to give you a set use, and again, the management of the energy, depending on the size and scope, if you look at the Public Utility Commission kinds of decisions they have to make, is quite different in terms of the size. So again, I think that these are all good places to cite, but I don't think it gets to the underlying issue of the capacity and the replacement on the grid with renewable energy.
That's correct.
And I'm kind of I'm interested with Thousand Friends because I don't know why that isn't a part. I mean, when you really analyze this, to me, that would be part of it. It just doesn't give us what you need longer term for the size and the population and what's necessary. So
That's correct. Yeah, to generate energy at the scale that you need to have a real impact to PGE's overall power consumption needs, you have to have wholesale power generation facilities. You simply cannot do that entirely with patchwork, small retail size projects.
it can be part of it, but it really
It certainly
doesn't
can
get
be
to
and
the-
should be.
It doesn't get to the real.
Yeah, and it absolutely has its place in the industry. And I think another important thing to note on that concept is that, as we mentioned, that this project connects into the distribution level at the Sandy substation to serve the power sources in the Sandy area. Any project that's not connected directly into Sandy's distribution network will not be serving that capacity. It will be serving the capacity wherever that is. So if you fill up rooftops in Portland, it will be serving Portland capacity. It will not be serving Sandy. Sandy will still be served by transmission that's coming from somewhere else.
So it's locale.
Exactly. That's a big part of our application, is that this project is based on the capacity in the Sandy area, and that's what this project is serving.
So there's actually even an urban-rural divide here, kind of, it seems, embedded in this.
Once again.
Because the kinds of areas where they would prefer seem to be urbanized areas that are already, can do this, but we're talking about rural economic development and rural capacities as well in a green way. Okay.
So we could go on and on about discussion. If you have specific questions about the application, please ask them, and then we can have a discussion after that. So first I have Ken, and then you.
Two quick questions, and specific ones per the request of the chair. One is, what is, or do you know what the line loss is over that 2 miles from production to the substation?
That's a good question. I actually don't have that number. It would be based on the power in the line and how close that line is to capacity. Really, the only one who could competently answer that would be PGE effectively, because you would need to know how much power is in the line at any given time and so on. It's obviously relatively small compared to many, many, many miles of high transmission line, but I can't tell you exactly what it is.
But there is some line loss.
Certainly there. I mean, in any electricity traveling through any line, there's loss.
I'm
Absolutely.
sort of asking that question for the benefit of people that haven't been electricians.
Sure.
The second question is, and this is the second time we've had one for 10 megawatts. What is the minimum size that for wholesale production that is financially viable?
It's an interesting question as well, and also it's locationally specific. If you have a ideal location, maybe adjacent to a substation where you have next to no potential upgrades for the line between the project and the facility. In Sandy's case, that's not possible because you cannot locate next to Sandy's substation with a small facility or any size facility due to the location of the sub. But probably around 2 megawatts is the smallest it could possibly be in an ideal situation. I don't know if any of those ideal situations exist in the immediate area. It does not exist in the Sandy area.
So if you wanted to do, I'll make this my last question, Mr. Chairman. That strikes me that it might be feasible to say, look at the parking lot of Clackamas Mall for a potential project in a location such as that, which doubles as a shelter for the automobiles that would be parked underneath it.
Well, so the cost to construct that facility is much, much higher than the cost to construct a ground-mounted facility. One of the reasons that these things work is that is actually the simplicity of the construction process. We go in, we do not do grading, we do not do anything else. We find sites that you can go in and basically start driving the piles in very quickly, and it's actually amazingly how efficient the construction process is. The guys go in, drive the piles right behind them, they put the racking in, and literally right behind them, the panels are going on, and they just go through the site. A parking structure like that, I mean, you can just imagine, obviously, the mall, among anything, needs to stay open. The construction while working around everybody there, the facility, you know, large steel structure above cars and everything like that, that project would never be financially viable at the wholesale power rates that these projects work at. Those kinds of projects, when they're built at schools and things like that, are based on retail power rates that the school is paying anyway, and net metering and reversing their retail power consumption.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Commissioner Fisher.
So I'm just curious about the energy that will be created by this facility, and will there be more produced that will go elsewhere outside of Sandy, or would this be specifically for Sandy?
It will be consumed, the vast majority of it will be consumed within Sandy. It is possible, although PGE has not indicated to us that any energy would leave the substation based on their evaluation of the system. But it is possible for unique points in time where the project is generating a lot of energy, and for whatever reason the Sandy area isn't requiring a lot. It's possible that some of it could leave, but that's quite unlikely. Number one, because PGE has not indicated to us that that would be the case. If it is, then that brings up the possibility for us to need to do upgrades on the existing transmission system, which is a financial non-starter for solar projects of this size. And we will not be having to do that with this project, and that is one reason why we don't believe that'll happen. Additionally, solar projects generate most of their energy when the highest consumption times are. Basically, when people are turning on their AC because it's very hot is when solar is producing most of its energy. So it actually pairs very well with the high use times in the grid. So it's not anticipated that this energy will be leaving the local Sandy area.
You have to go? Oh, no.
Oh, no. No, go.
Absolutely.
Okay, so any other questions? Okay, so we're going to close the public portion of the hearing and deliberate. So let's kind of just go down the line. I'll tell you that for me, there is a difference between this one and that one. The other thing is that these are all being appealed. And this is one I'd like to hear the answer on from the LCDC. I agree with Thousand Friends. I have lots of the same concerns, but I'm kind of interested in where you are, and because there's only 4 of us here, I lean towards a no, and I'm guessing yes, and that leaves us at a tie, and that means that, I don't know what that means exactly. I guess it would have to, it would just would.
Means you don't have a yes and you don't have a no, so the application's still pending. What we'd probably recommend is that we, or that you vote to set the meeting over and we schedule a new time. I know we're getting into AOC and the holidays, and so finding a time might be a bit difficult. But a couple considerations. If you do have a tie, again, you don't have a yes and you don't have a no, so it just sort of exists in this purgatory until we can get a decision from the board.
Well, that's why I'm almost tempted to vote yes, so that it will have an opportunity to be appealed, along with all the others that are being appealed.
So the process would be that if a party was inclined to appeal, they would have 21 days to appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals. What I suspect would happen is, since it is essentially the same question that is currently on appeal with Jackson County, is that we'd have a good chance to have that also stayed to allow that question to be answered. And if it's adverse to this particular application, we have the opportunity to voluntarily remand it and for the county to reconsider the decision. If it comes out that that it is appropriate to use Goal 13 to prioritize over Goal 3 in the way that the applicant and staff have recommended, then then the appeal would probably be dropped, because frankly, there's nothing further to litigate on that point. So, so if you did want to put it into issue, if you did vote yes on this, I guess we'd see how the appeals shake out and go from there.
So
We don't know if there will be an appeal.
We don't know if there would be an appeal. A yes vote, if there was no appeal, would allow this project to be constructed.
Jim,
Well, I don't disagree with Thousand Friends' general view of protecting the environment. That's not an issue as far as I'm concerned. But that's one of the reasons I asked some of the questions I asked, particularly about the parking lot question being a critical one, because I've always thought that would be a great idea. But if you're talking about wholesale generation, and that's what we're talking about, it's pretty clear that that's not a viable option. So that means that, if the mall wanted to put something like that in and do it as a retail type of thing, you're talking really about a whole different ballgame. This actually, in some respects, is a better application than the previous one in that, there's no question that there's been a number of attempts to farm the land. It's been unsuccessful. In terms of the timber question that Commissioner Fisher mentioned, let's remember that over 53% of our land is federal national forest, and if you take all the privately owned lands that are also forest lands, we approach 75 or 77% of the land is in timber as we speak, and only 6 or 8% of our land is actually urbanized. So, and then the worst case scenario, as the applicant has pointed out, would be 0.02% if they were able to build every single plant that would work with the substations we have in Clackamas County, which is 386 acres or something to that effect, I think it was. And then the final thing is, as I said at the previous one, we're basically dealing with two conflicting good things. We want to get off of coal. We want to get off of oil. PG&E made a good faith deal to do that over the course of the next few years. That means we have to make it possible for alternative production methods to be produced. So I'm going to vote yes.
yeah, not to be critical, it's PGE. PG and E is actually different.
I always want to throw that E in there, or the and in there, but you're correct.
Commissioner Smith, I mean,
Do you want me to vote?
Commissioner Schrader.
Whoa.
My mood is deteriorating rapidly. I'm just. Okay, I'm a yes on this too, because I really think that this is an issue that, again, it's the balance between agriculture, land use, power generation. I particularly like it because, having been a pollination ecologist, I think the fact that the mitigation with, I think the plantings would be a huge piece for me, because I think that is essential. So I'm really feeling good about that. And I really don't have an issue with Thousand Friends. I worked with them for a very long time. Actually, in Salem, we were the go-to office for land use for Thousand Friends, because at the time they were excluded from being at the table because of the nature of the political makeup, so I understand that. But my concern with this, and this is one message I'd like to get to them, they talk about agriculture and they talk about it as part of the economy, but I get that, but there's no data. There's no data to show what is happening with the Christmas tree, for example, industry. My sense is it's on a downswing right now. There's no data on how much that is actually generating. I mean, it's a good narrative, but there aren't any specifics. And as someone who's kind of actively been hands-on with farming, I want more. If you're going to make a case that it's agricultural, then again, what is it generating for the local rural economy would be something I would like to ask them to really specifically address in more detail. Okay, that's important to me. And again, I'm with Commissioner Humbertson on this. I think that it is a real tension. I'm willing to be a yes on this one too, because again, I see it as farming energy. And I think that it will help a rural area. And yes, I am aware that the other energy will become part of the larger grid. That's also part of the green economy. It's not just the local piece of it, it's part of the local grid to increase that larger capacity. So, okay,
All right,
I'm done.
you want to say anything? Or you want to just move on to a vote?
Yeah, I think we can move on to a vote. I'm always looking at the larger public policy implications and the bigger picture. I would really prefer to hold on this to see how that other appeal goes through, but I don't know how the timing is on that.
Again, Luba is required to make a decision. I think it's 66 days or 88 days. I forget what it is off the top of my head. But last I calculated, I think we're about a month or a month and a half out from the time that they're required to make a decision on the Jackson County case. And again, we assume that that will answer the question that is at the root of all these appeals. But I guess they could punt on it as well. So that's.
And I know that Commissioner Savas was asking that question yesterday about if it's possible for us to hold on this until that decision, but I don't know about the timing of this. so.
Well, I very much got the impression he was a yes.
Okay,
I did very much.
I don't know.
And for me, I'm on the fence.
Well,
But I tend to be falling towards a yes because of the soils. And its location, it's right by Shorty's, basically. It's flat land just above the highway. And it's, the other argument is, and I actually heard this last night, and that is you're preventing the sun from hitting the ground where grasses grow and other things grow. So in some sense, you are impacting the environment by preventing it from going to the ground. The other thing is that we're not burning coal. And, my guess is this will be appealed if we vote yes, and by the same people who wrote us a letter last time, and it's appealing the last one. And that answer, we need to answer that. But the big difference here is the soil. And it's not that he's guessing. It's not that he said, this soil's crappy, I can't grow anything. It's actually in an area where the soil is poor, is not as good for farming, unlike, let's say, the Schrader farm, which if they
You
suggested
mean
solar on there, I'd fight it to the death.
Well, it's the hops empire, so that won't happen anytime soon.
So I think we should move to a vote, and I feel that if we delay this, there's going to be a yes vote, and then we just delay it for no reason. So entertain a motion.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would move that we approve the applicant's application.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that we approve, and I got to make sure I'm on the right page, Z0287-17-CP and Z0288-17-C. Any further discussion? Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Passes 3-1. Thank you. Now, the next hearings, oh, wait, I got to say some stuff, don't I? Now that Z0287-17-CP and Z0288-17C have been approved, we'll direct staff to draft an ordinance reflecting today's decision and include it on an agenda for a board adoption at a future business meeting, correct?
That's correct.
And with that, we'll close the hearing and adjourn the meeting for Kevin to change the tape. We have 3 more. Pledge of Allegiance again.
Nope, we don't.
We could do it 4 more times. Oh, we're on, okay. All right, let me find my stuff. I assume this is a different, oh, here we are. Okay. I'll call to order the October 18, 2017 land use hearing. Before we, okay. At this hearing, we'll consider public testimony and deliberate on 4 separate requests. A request to remove a historic landmark designation on a property described as 21E012AA, tax lot 7700. A request to remove a historic landmark designation on a property described as 22E028CA, tax lot 400. A request to designate the W.A. Shaw Building on a property described as 22E18CD, tax lot 900, as a historic landmark, and a request to decrease the historic overlay zone designated on property described as 21E02DA, tax lot 5000, in the associated Frank A. Heitkamper House to only parcel 2 of partition plat number 2017-053. Will you-
Mr. Chairman, are we allowed to take these in one large block and vote all of them at one time?
We
after
do need to
discussion?
have separate hearings.
Have to have them as separate
For
hearings,
each,
okay.
and,
Yeah,
and discrete votes for each, but yes. And for purposes of the script, Mr. Chair, you can, since nobody's here, we can probably dispense with describing what the process will be, since I don't.
Okay.
Since the applicants aren't here.
All right.
And with your blessing, I'll go ahead and just read the disclosure that we need
So
on the
where
record.
would we be then, on page 3?
We'll pick up with Linda Price's staff report
Oh, the,
on page 4, I suppose it is.
okay, that's where I am now.
So the required disclosure that we need, that all the criteria that can be used in reaching a decision has been identified in the staff report, of course. Failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements and evidence sufficient to afford the decision maker an opportunity to respond may preclude appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals on that issue. Failure of the applicant to raise any constitutional issues relating to the proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow the local government an opportunity to respond would preclude action for damages in circuit court. Once final, the decisions may be appealed to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals, and I will ask if there's any bias or ex parte context related to any of these applications. Seeing none, if anybody that does show up wishes to challenge the impartiality of the commissioners, they must do so on the record.
Okay, so we're ready for a staff report. Will you please introduce yourself, by the way?
Yeah, my name is Linda Price, and I'm a senior planner with the Planning and Zoning Division here in Clackamas County. And so here, what we're talking about here again is 4 different applications. The first 2 that we're going through is asking to have the historic landmark overlay zone removed. The third one again is the W.A. Shaw Building to be designated historic landmark. And the fourth one is to shrink down the size to the lot of a partition. So the first one is, the owner of the property is Dmitry Mitiev, and he submitted an application to demolish the historic landmark house. It's called the Oatfield House on Oatfield Road, and remove the HL overlay district. He has gone through the process. This went through even a public hearing with the hearings officer. The building has been declared a dangerous building by the building code division here, and the approval for the demolition permit has been given, and that demolition permit has been issued. So this is the first one. Staff recommends that the HL overlay be removed from this parcel.
Okay, Are there any questions?
You want to go through?
Go ahead.
I'm kind of curious, does the county have any, we used to years ago? I remember when Pam Hayden was here, we had a very robust historic program. So this is in disrepair and has been deemed dangerous, but the county no longer offers that kind of infrastructure help
We have
to help
none. We have
maintain
no-
and/or otherwise?
We have no monetary programs available. They disappeared, I guess, in about 2002. They were part of big community block grants that we could get some monies through the housing department, but we have not had any since 2002. There aren't any funds available from the county.
Because I remember it used to be robust, and our historic farm actually received money from the county to repair the historic floor of the barn.
Right.
And part of the impetus of this was because we had done such a, work with Goal 5 and identified all these particular sites and particular structures that, again, we would help educate people on preservation so we wouldn't lose the inventory that we have. So this is kind of one of these structures that it is dangerous, there's no other, and the Historic Review Board only said that because of the danger. But
Right.
it is a lost historic resource.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and I know the community was pretty upset about it, but, I don't know how we resolve that one.
Well, I think that we need to, I will have an idea that during the budget process, I think we should take a look at the program we had, the infrastructure that was in place, the monetary costs, because we're going to continue to lose these structures that are important for our local history unless we intervene. So, and we have done it before. It was a precedent for this, and I don't even know, Linda, if I ask, where's the inventory right now? We had
have an
actually a
inventory.
historic structure
yes.
inventory.
Yes, we still
Is-
do.
That's all digital, or it's?
Yes, we have it
Okay.
that way too. We have about 350 designated historic landmarks.
And this was on that list?
Yes.
Okay.
And it
Ken-
was, again, it's on Oatfield Road.
Yeah, I know
It was
where it
built
is.
by an Oatfield, and so it is too bad of what has happened to it, but it has been in disrepair now for over 20 years.
Right.
So,
Okay, Ken?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, under pages of summaries and recommendation, I'm noting that we have a file number Z0086-86,
yes.
and then Z0092-03, and then Z026617,
Right, the third.
and then on the back page, it repeats file numbers Z0086-86.
And why those numbers are there, that's the original zoning file that designated these parcels as historic landmarks.
Okay.
So the first one and the last one were both done at the same time with the same board order in '86.
And I asked the same question because there was, about 30
at that
resources that
time.
were designated on
That
that
very
same
first
board
time.
order. So
So when we vote, when we cast our vote on the first one, which is Dmitry Matveev,
We have,
will we be also voting on the fourth one at the same time, or will we be taking it separately?
we'll be taking it separate. And
Okay.
in the script, I've separated out the new zoning numbers.
I don't have the script, I just have that, and I just want to be sure that there wasn't an error in the nomenclature.
Nope, appreciate it, yes.
Okay. And other than that, I'm good to go.
Commissioner.
So I have our materials here. I just want to make sure this is all the materials that we have on this, which is the staff recommendation.
Right.
Okay, so that's all we've received. There isn't any other exhibits or any other comments or anything else that we've been given?
I don't know what they were all given. Okay, no.
Okay, so I just want to make sure, because we're having a little challenge here this morning with our materials and
okay.
checking on our iPads, and I just want to make sure I have all the information. So if I'm reading this correctly, the Historic Review Board reviewed all of this. There was a public process, there was public input, and there was a vote that said, yes, do this, and we are basically following the Historic Review Board's recommendation.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just curious, from the input from the community, was there any objections when they went through their process? Or was this purely consensus?
Yes, there was opposition from the community concerning it, but again, we went through a long process of trying to come up with alternatives of someone buying the property or someone else putting together the funds to develop it, and none of that came to fruition.
Okay, and can you just tell me a little bit more about the opposition from the community? And the reason why I ask is there was the Evangelical Center that was lost to the community, is going to be developed. And as a new commissioner, I'm hearing a lot about, oh, that's just so terrible that this happened. And I don't want to be part of a vote that the community's very concerned about, and because I don't have any information about what happened, other than what's on these
Sure.
two pieces of paper.
The major opposition, or the people that were most concerned, is the Oak Grove History Detectives. There is a group there that has put together lots of information. They were very involved also with the third one we're going to go through, actually having the Shaw Building designated. They put together a big information on that one. But again, they, of course, were very concerned that this property, again, was built by an Oatfield and lived in by the Oatfields. And it, again, the road next to it is Oatfield Road. They would have liked to have had the buyer rehab the building, but again, going through all the different analysis by several structural engineers and finally our building code officials there, that the cost to rehabilitate this was way over anything that these people could come up with. So they came with another plan, trying to, again, get it to move, but there was also the problems of moving it because of the foundation and the deterioration, and to get something in there and then moving the wires to move it to somewhere else could never come together to try and do it. So again, yes, they would have liked to have something happen with this. We did have our review of it even go longer than usual. It's usually a 4 to 6 week process, but there was a continuance of things trying to get something together. So they worked for it for about 9 months, and nothing has come.
And was there consensus at the end of the process by the members in the community that demolishing the site was the only solution?
I don't know the community. I know the Historic Review Board members, and again, the history detectives would have loved for something to come to help it. But I think we do have some comments throughout the board that they understand how bad shape this building it is, and it's too bad that someone didn't help this family 20 years ago to make it a more viable option, and are, sad to see it go, but that is the case in this regard.
Counselor?
I don't want to deviate too much from this conversation that's happening, but I do think it is helpful to understand part of the process too, because these historic, these don't follow the same track as some of our other land use applications. And what I mean by this is that you have 4 applications in front of you today that are really zoning conformance decisions. The more controversial part of the action that took place, the demolition of the structure, the partition, like you'll hear, that's already been decided. And so because of how our process is, the demolition permit in this case went before the Historic Review Board and then went before the hearings officer. And that was decided, and the permits were issued. It hasn't been demolished yet, from my understanding. What you're doing here is you are removing, or you're being asked to remove the overlay because the historical amenity isn't there anymore. And so it's really bringing the zoning into conformance with the reality of what's on the ground. And so perhaps that helps a bit, because if it was the demolition permit, we'd probably have people here speaking in opposition. The reason that people aren't here, I suspect, is because the more controversial part of the action has already been decided.
Okay. And was there a possibility for an appeal process for them?
That would have been appealed to LUBA, yeah.
And they did not appeal? Okay, that really helps me, Nate, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, these are just cleaning up the
Yep.
list. kind
Yep,
of
thank you.
decisions
And thank you
to
for explaining the process. It was good to know.
make. Okay, yes.
I do think it's important to clean up the list, but I think that this exemplifies the loss that we're really having with our historic resources in this county. So even though I will support these, I'm very disturbed by the fact that our resource inventory, we're crossing things off a list rather than, we are adding one historic structure to the list, but it's the loss, and it's the infrastructure to prevent that loss that hasn't happened in a number of years, so.
All right, so we're going to open the public hearing for testimony. I see none. I'll close the public hearing. And any further discussion? All right, so I'll call for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to approve file number Z0086-86.
Second,
Okay, so where do you see that number?
I don't know.
That's not,
That was the one that was identified in the staff report. For clarity, I did include the correct numbers, the correct designations on the script. They didn't get translated onto the staff report, and so,
so the motion should be to approve Z0361-17-PDR.
So moved.
correct.
Is there a
So,
second?
Second.
And it's been moved and seconded. Maybe I'll read these in case.
Yeah, that would be good.
It's been moved and seconded to approve Z0361-17-PDR. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. The next item is,
Okay.
so do we just start over on the script, kind of? A staff report first off?
Staff report first off, we can just
Okay.
go right into
Staff
that.
report on the next item.
Okay, this is for another application that was submitted, and again, the demolition. This one kind of fell through my cracks. I'll just have to take through that. This happened several years ago. Brad Ellsworth did come to the Historic Review Board and went through the process to, again, remove, demolish his house, the house that he was living in, Charles, the Livesey house. And that one was approved. The demolition permit went through. We went through that process. And I thought that I had brought this one already to the board to clean up the mapping, to take off the HL designation. So again, this is another recommendation from staff to remove the HL mapping designation from the zoning maps.
And for the record, I'll clarify that the correct reference to application number is Z0605-09-HL on this one.
Okay, so any questions of staff? We'll open the public hearing, see if there's anyone who'd like to testify, and seeing no one, we'll close the public hearing and entertain a motion to pass Z0605-09-HL.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded to pass Z0605-09-HL. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. The next is file number, application number 3, Z0266, let me see, yeah, -17-HL. And first up, staff report.
The owners of this property, the Brush and Palette Art Association, submitted their application to designate their building, the W.A. Shaw Building, on Jennings Road, right off McLaughlin Boulevard, as a historic landmark. The building was constructed in 1910, and it features narrow rectangular volumes and arranged at right angles on a gabled roof. The building was constructed to house the real estate company who was selling subdivision lots in the Lodge and Jennings Lodge areas in the early 1900s. It later became the Jennings Lodge Community Club. In 1986, the building was sold to the Brush and Palette Art Association, who has taken care of it ever since. It is a visual landmark in the area, and part of our process is evaluation with numbers that the Historic Review Board has to evaluate, and in order to become a historic landmark, you have to have at least 40 points. This evaluation for this building was 60, and so the Historic Review Board recommends to they recommended approval of it becoming a designated landmark and recommend to the commissioners to also approve it and make the the appropriate mapping of changes that have to be done.
Okay. Any questions? So I'll open the public hearing and ask if anyone would like to testify. See no one here in the audience. We'll close the public hearing and entertain a motion to pass Z0266-17-HL.
So move.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to pass Z0266-17-HL. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. And there's one more in here, just a second. And that is application number 4, Z0320-15-HL. And first off, we'll have a presentation by staff.
Again, 2 years ago, this property went through the process of being partitioned, and at that time, it was also went through the Historic Review Board, who looked at it and used the criteria in Section 707 dealing with keeping the relative structural elements of the historic structure together on one lot so that they not be divided off. They also look at such things as the landscaping around the property, which also, again, at this particular lot, the original landscaping has been gone for quite a few years, so they didn't have anything there. But again, the lot, the house, and a outbuilding were put together on this one lot. And so when they approved it and recommended that the map changes be made once the partition was actually finalized, which just happened earlier this fall. And so again, staff recommends that the Board of County Commissioners reduce the historic landmark overlay zone on this property and make the relevant mapping changes.
So in this case, there were 2 lots that were originally designated and were reducing it to 1 lot.
No, it was 1 lot that was partitioned into 3, and the middle lot is the one that contains historic dwelling, the structure on it.
So it's 1 lot of record partitioned into 3.
Right.
And we're just
Shrinking.
designate one piece of that partition as historic.
Correct, and removing the designation on the 2 non-contributing resultant parcels.
Okay, so any other questions of staff? Open the public hearing, ask if anyone would like to testify. See no one in the audience. We'll close the public hearing and entertain a motion to pass Z0320-15-HL. Is there a motion?
So move.
Second.
Moved and second to pass Z0320-15-HL. Any further deliberation? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. With that, we will be closing. None of these are appealable to, what, yes?
So we do need to have you adopt board orders, and we'll do that in the same way that we do every other land use application that comes before you. We'll have you direct staff to
Okay.
adopt the board orders at a later business meeting, and we assume that's your wishes.
Okay, so I'm going to say that. Now that the amendments have been approved, we'll direct staff to draft an order reflecting today's decisions and include it on an agenda for this board's adoption in a future business meeting. With that, we'll be closing today's hearing.
Thank you very much.